Yeah, so I want to start my talk by motivating it with a very simple example. So suppose you're learning a couple of different languages, and perhaps you've learned that red in English has the same meaning as rouge in French. And you've separately also, maybe you've been in France and took a Spanish language course, and so you've learned that rouge and rojo also have the same meaning. Now, if you know these two facts, you can also generalize to novel combinations of these words to infer that red and rojo also have the same meaning. And so more broadly, understanding the structure between different relations and the rules governing these relations allows us to generalize in this manner to novel combinations of components. This is an ability often known as combinatoric or compositional generalization. Notably, this has been a really influential framework in both cognitive science and machine learning. Now, indeed, it's been known for a very long time that humans and animals routinely adapt to novel situations by decomposing them into familiar components and thinking about the rules that govern sort of these compositions of familiar components. Now, this is relevant in domains like relational cognition. Language, of course, is famously highly compositional. And more broadly, it's really relevant for pretty much any domain in higher order cognition. Similarly, in machine learning, as we've started wanting to develop learning systems that are able to generalize to situations unlike anything they've ever seen before, compositionality has similarly been a really important framework, and I'm just highlighting a couple of papers written on this topic before that I really like. Indeed, one example for a kind of compositional generalization problem has been the helmet-wearing monkey on skates earlier. That's something that maybe the model has never seen before, and nevertheless, we'd like it to generate this new image based on the components of this image it's familiar with. Notably, models of how humans, animals, as well as machine learning models should be able to do this often involve an inference over some kind of structured representation. For instance, a representation of a graph or a causal model. But there's also been a really influential alternative approach where we just train generic learning models on compositional tasks, and we sort of cross our fingers and hope that they're going to be able to generalize. And notably, that's been a really influential approach in recent years in particular as well. But there are very few guarantees, and we really don't quite understand from a theoretical perspective when this works and when it doesn't work. So broadly, it remains unclear when more unstructured learning models generalize compositionally. A particular challenge in this context is the sheer diversity of different compositional tasks. Now, broadly speaking, it really doesn't make sense to think of compositional generalization as a monolith. Just because a given model successfully generalizes compositionally in one context doesn't necessarily tell you that it should also compositionally generalize in a different context, especially when we have these unstructured learning models. So in this context, it's really important to develop a systematic theory of compositional generalization across entire families of tasks. Now, that's something where, in the context of structured models, we've made a lot of progress, but we're sort of still in the beginning stages of developing this theory for more unstructured models. And today, I want to tell you about some of our recent efforts to pursue this work. Now, specifically, the family of compositional tasks we're going to be considering is any task that involves an input that's just a set of categorical components and a simple scalar output. So for example, you could imagine a regression framework or a binary classification framework. We're then going to train our model on certain combinations of these components and test them on novel combinations of these components. So for example, if we go back to the motivating example, you might imagine operationalizing it as an input that just consists of two components, the pair of the words, and your desired output is just a binary classification into whether those two words have the same meaning or not. And so now if you train your model on certain combinations of words, can it use transitive rules to generalize to novel combinations of words? Importantly, we impose no constraints on the input-output mapping, and so as long as you can conceptualize your task in these shapes, our theory will be able to speak to this task. So in particular, here is a little bag of possible tasks that fall under this framework. I'll return to some of these examples throughout the talk. Now, the learning model we consider here is a really, really simple learning model. So specifically, we're going to assume that the input simply concatenates a one-hot vector representing each of our categorical components. This is followed by some random weights neural network, potentially deep, potentially with different nonlinearities. We're going to assume that this network exists in an infinite width limit. So this gives rise to some nonlinear fixed hidden representation. We're going to assume that we simply learn the linear readout weights based on the training data using gradient descent. Now, importantly, under those assumptions, it turns out that we have an analytical expression describing the generalization behavior of these models. So specifically, it depends on this representation only through its induced kernel, so the dot product between any two possible input points. So specifically, when we look at model behavior on a new data point, This depends on the similarity of this new data point to the training data kernel, and the training outputs. We're going to exploit this relationship to make precise statements about the manner in which these models compositionally generalize. So overall, in our work, we have shown that these kernel models under this setup are constrained to a specific compositional computation. So that essentially allows us to distinguish between tasks that these models could in principle generalize on, and these models and tasks where we can immediately prove that these kernel models are fundamentally unable to generalize. We then show that even on tasks that they can in principle solve, there are certain statistical biases that could prevent models from generalizing successfully. And we found that this theory can help us better understand compositional generalization and deep networks trained on visual compositional tasks as well. Now, in the interest of time, in today's talk, I'm just going to be talking about the first topic. The other two topics are in the paper, so I encourage you to check out the paper if you're interested in that, or find me later during the conference. All right. So to warm up, let's consider a simple linear readout from the input representation. In that case, our model is constrained to implementing a component-wise additive function. And so that immediately means that when our task is additive in its different components, such a model will generalize perfectly. But it cannot even learn the training set for non-additive tasks. And of course, many different compositional functions involve non-additive interactions between different inputs. And so that's really a pretty fundamental limitation. Notably, a nonlinear transformation overcomes this limitation. We've previously seen a reference to the universal function approximation theorem. Such models can learn arbitrary training data. But often it becomes quite hard to make rigorous statements about the kinds of functions that they can implement. In our case, though, we can take advantage of a particular property of the kernel arising from this nonlinear transformation. So specifically, if you look at the kernel induced by the input data, and you think about taking a dot product between two possible inputs, essentially, when you want to compute that similarity, you just end up counting up the number of identical components. And so it turns out that when we apply these nonlinear transformations in the infinite width limit, the resulting kernel will still have this structure, except it might change the specific numbers of these different numbers of identical components. But more generally, the representational similarity will still only depend on the number of identical components between the two data points. So in this sense, these nonlinear kernels still have a compositional structure. And we're going to characterize the specific limitations arising from such a compositional structure. Now, our main theoretical contribution, I'm going to state today in very informal terms. But of course, in the paper, we state this in much more formal terms. So again, as a reminder, for the input representation, the model ends up summing up a value for each component. We call this component-wise additivity. And we found that for a nonlinear representation, there's a sort of analogous limitation. So in this case, the model sums up a value for each combination of components seen during training. We call this conjunction-wise additivity. It's a bit of a mouthful, and so I'll spend the next couple of slides unpacking what exactly that means. All right, so let's start by considering a task with two components. So for example, maybe our training set consists of red squares, red triangles, and blue squares. And our test component is a novel combination of these features, so a blue triangle. In this case, for a training set input, we've seen both each component by itself. So we've seen the color before, we've seen the shape before, but we've also seen this specific combination of components. So for that reason, we can both assign a value to each component by itself, but also to this specific combination of components. In contrast, on the test set input, we've seen the color before and we've seen the shape before, but we've never seen the specific combination of a blue triangle. So for that reason, the model behavior must be additive in the two components. More broadly, this is broadly true of tasks with two components. And so this means that even though kernel models can learn arbitrary training sets using the conjunctive part of their representation on the training set, there's no such conjunctive part on the test set. And so therefore, in that case, they are limited to generalizing only on component-wise additive tasks. Importantly, that's not because the model does not represent in its input representation this novel combination of components. It's more that even though this is a part of the input representation, it's never learned how to use it. All right, so we immediately see that this gives us a very nice criterion to understand the kinds of tasks that these kernel models could or could not generalize on, perhaps with some surprising implications. So first, let's consider generalizing over ordered relations. So the scenario here would be that we are given certain items, and we should classify which of those items is bigger. It's a really influential task in the cognitive sciences because it relates to a very fundamental ability to perform relational reasoning. Now, for example, you might learn that A is bigger than B is bigger than C, and so on. And so you've only been told about the relationship between these adjacent items in this hierarchy. And we now want to generalize for its non-adjacent items using the transitive rule. Notably, we can implement this kind of computation by assigning a rank to each of our items and simply subtracting the two ranks from each other, which is a component-wise additive computation. As a result, we immediately know that kernel models in principle can solve this task. On the other hand, now let's consider a pretty similar task where we want to transitively generalize over equivalence relations. So, for example, maybe we've been told that certain words have the same meaning and certain words have different meanings. We now want to use the transitive rule to generalize this to novel pairs of words. Now, this again involves the application of the transitive rule to generalize over relations. But in this case, the test set has a non-additive structure because in contrast to an ordered relation, encoding equality relations is fundamentally nonlinear. It has an XOR type structure. And so for that reason, we immediately know that these kernel models with categorical compositional inputs cannot possibly generalize on this task. Importantly, they can learn in the training set. So this is not inconsistent with the results of the universal function approximation theorem. But we immediately know that they'd be unable to generalize on this task. More broadly, this implies that generalizing over ordered relations versus equivalence relations, even though from a conceptual perspective they appear to be quite similar, actually requires fundamentally different computational mechanisms for generalization. And I think that's a nice illustration of why I think these kinds of formal perspectives on compositionality in these unstructured models is really important. All right. In the case of tasks with more than two components, the same kinds of ingredients apply. It just becomes a little more complicated because suddenly we have, more than two components. So as a simple example, we're going to assume a context dependence task where input consists of, is a simple object with a given shading, a given color, and a given shape. So in particular, we're going to want to classify these objects by color if they are lightly shaded, and by shape if they're darkly shaded. And so if you have experience with these inputs, and you now see a lightly shaded blue triangle, you immediately know where you would group this because you've understood sort of the context-dependent rule underlying this relationship. Now, can kernel models perform this kind of generalization? So again, recall the computation these kernel models implement is they assign a value to each specific combination of components they've seen during training. So what are the combinations of components they've seen in the training data here? Well, they've seen each component by itself, of course. But context dependence is a nonlinear computation. And so for this reason, this component-wise additive function could not learn this context dependence operation. However, they've also seen certain combinations of components. So in particular, they've seen the context together with the color, and they've seen the context together with the shape. And they can exploit these two parts of their representation to generalize to these novel inputs because they can express this context dependence relation. Notably, there's also certain combinations that the model has not seen before. So in particular, it's never seen a blue triangle. And so any task that would involve learning a specific value assigned to blue triangles could not be solved in this framework. So overall, what this suggests is that conjunction-wise additivity, this new computational motif that we discovered here, is more flexible than component-wise additivity because it allows the models to rely on these familiar combinations of components. But it still is a constrained compositional computation that sort of imposes pretty strong constraints on whether or not these kernel models are able to successfully generalize. All right, so overall, what this allows us to understand is we can sort of take this broad bag of possible models that we've seen previously, and we can order it into those tasks that are conjunction-wise additive and therefore can be solved by these kernel models, and tasks that are non-additive and therefore cannot be solved by these kernel models. So overall, I'd like to argue that conjunction-wise additivity defines a useful new generalization class for compositional tasks. I want to spend the last couple of minutes illustrating the kinds of things that we can do with this framework. And we go into much more detail on this in the paper. So specifically, if a task is conjunction-wise additive, that does not guarantee to us that the model is going to learn to generalize correctly, because we still rely on whether the model is able to discover the right kind of conjunction-wise additive function. Now, notably, this can depend on the specific training data statistics and the model's representational geometry. So depending on what your specific nonlinearity is, what particular combinations of components you've seen before, certain models might or might not generalize. So in our paper, we also find that models are affected by certain statistical biases. So they tend to memorize the specific combinations of components seen during training. And they also tend to be sensitive to spurious correlations that do not generalize to the test set. We then we then run experiments involving residual networks and vision transformers on sort of visual compositional versions of these tasks, training these networks with backpropagation. So even though these models are very different from our simplified learning model that we considered in our theory, we find that our theory still helps us understand the conditions under which these networks generalize or do not generalize, and moreover helps us to predict in which ways these networks fail to generalize. On the other hand, if a task is not conjunction-wise additive, we immediately know that other learning mechanisms must be responsible for successful generalization. And so if we're interested in understanding the role of, say, feature learning for compositional generalization, we might want to make sure that the task we're testing our neural networks on is non-additive so as to avoid a spurious solution that could be found even by a simplified learning model. So in particular, what we show in this paper is that neural networks trained in a regime that induces representation learning are able to generalize on this transitive equivalence task, so they're able to transitively generalize over equivalence relations. So in summary, what I've told you today, I'm a little early, but I hope that's not a problem. We found that kernel models with categorical compositional inputs are constrained to conjunction-wise additive computations. So what this means is that they sum up values assigned to each combination of components seen during training. And this allows us to partition tasks into those solvable by these kernel models and those that require different learning mechanisms. In the future, I'm hoping to use this kind of foundation to understand how more sophisticated learning models, particular models representing graphs, can overcome the constraints imposed by these kernel models. So I'm looking forward to seeing more approaches that might help us overcome these constraints at this conference. So I want to thank my advisor, Kim Starkenfeld, who supervised this project, as well as my other advisor, Larry Abbott. I also want to thank all the members of my labs and my funding sources. And I want to thank all of you for your attention.
So this is the type of question I think people shouldn't ask, but I'm going to ask it because people do it. So, if you have n categories that define something, what you show with kernels is that what you can and you cannot do. So my question is, if I have a kernel of infinite width, I would only require n to the 2 to the n. Relationships between the n categories of each product, right?
So you have n binary components.
Correct.
With arbitrary combinations.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you have not seen the 2 to the n, then you will not be able to generalize. That's more or less the idea of, if I understand correctly.
So that depends, yeah.
My question is, what is the, if I were to add a regularizer, what is a regularizer that recovers the pairwise relationships? Have you explored that? That's why.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to be clear, under certain conditions, we can generalize to novel combinations of these components, right? So as long as they are, they only involve assigning values to combination to sort of subsets that we've seen before, we can recover those relationships. It's just that if we cannot express our test set generalization in those terms, that we cannot do this. Now, I can tell you one thing that does not help with this, which is L2 regularization. So the same limitation applies to models that are L2 regularized as well. I think one thing that could help under certain conditions is a sparsity regularization. So indeed, you can think of these neural networks in the representation learning regime as imbuing a kind of sparsity regularization that we find helps us generalize on this equivalence relation. So I think there's some interesting work to be done in that direction, but I don't have any results on that here.
Yeah, I think related to that conditions under which the kernel model generalizes when there's more than two components?
Yeah, so I think intuitively you can think of each component as sort of like standing on its own, but you could also think of each combination of components you've seen before as you having sort of experienced those together, right? So if you've previously seen a blue triangle, say, you can kind of you can think about your past experience with the color blue and the shape of a triangle, but you can also think about your past experience with a specific combination of components, which is a blue triangle. And so what this theorem tells us is that essentially we sort of like we pool together our prior experiences and just sort of like add them together. So whenever there's something more complicated that we have to do in interacting with these different components, we're not going to be able to do that. For example, in the context dependence task, we've seen that we rely on we rely on having seen each context together with each of the color and the shape. And so we immediately know that if we construct this task in a way where we maybe haven't seen a certain context in conjunction with a certain feature, that the kernel model would not be able to generalize in that case.